Daniel Hayes strode confidently toward the entrance of the Westbridge Police Department, his mind already working through the details of the corruption case he had been appointed to lead. As a high-profile civil rights attorney, Daniel had built a reputation for exposing misconduct within law enforcement, often representing victims of wrongful arrests, police brutality, and institutional discrimination. His work had earned him both admiration and resentment, particularly from those who had much to lose if the truth came to light. Today was supposed to be the beginning of a crucial investigation, one that had the potential to dismantle a network of corruption deeply embedded in the local police force. He had been assigned as the independent legal overseer, ensuring transparency and accountability in the process. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his leather briefcase in one hand, he glanced at his watch. He was 10 minutes early, just as he liked to be, but before he could step onto the precinct's front steps, a voice cut through the morning air. "Hey, stop right there." Daniel turned to see two uniformed officers approaching with purposeful strides. One was tall and broad-shouldered, his expression stern. The other was younger, seemingly following the lead of his senior partner. Daniel slowed his steps, raising an eyebrow. "Can I help you, officers?" "ID," the taller officer demanded. His tone clipped. Daniel frowned slightly, but remained calm. "May I ask why?" "You fit the description of a suspect in the area." "Just routine," the officer replied. Daniel had heard this before. "A suspect?" he asked, keeping his voice measured. "And what description would that be?" "Just hand over your ID," the officer insisted. Sensing where this was heading, Daniel sighed and reached into his inner pocket, pulling out his identification. As he handed it over, he kept his gaze steady on the officer's face. The man barely glanced at it before his partner chimed in. "We're going to have to check your vehicle." Daniel's jaw tensed. "On what grounds?" "Suspicious behavior." Daniel let out a slow breath, his patience thinning. "I'm an attorney. I'm here on official business. If you check that badge properly, you'll see I have an appointment with the department." The taller officer smirked. "An attorney, huh? That's a new one." Without waiting for Daniel's consent, the younger officer moved past him and began peering into the tinted windows of his car. Daniel's pulse quickened, but he remained composed. "That's an unlawful search. I haven't given you permission, and you have no probable cause." The officers exchanged glances, and suddenly Daniel felt a firm grip on his arm. "You're coming with us." Daniel stiffened. "On what charge?" "You're being detained for further questioning." Before he could argue, the cold bite of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Daniel inhaled sharply, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. He had represented clients who had been through this. He had fought against injustices like this for years. But now, it was happening to him. As they led him toward the police station, he glanced at the large sign above the entrance, the very place where he was supposed to walk in as a leader of justice. Instead, he was being dragged in like a criminal. He kept his head high. They had no idea who they had just arrested. Daniel sat in a dimly lit holding cell, his hands now free from the cuffs, but his wrists still aching from their tight grip. The room smelled of stale air and disinfectant, the kind of sterile environment that had seen too many people unjustly detained. He had expected this kind of treatment in his line of work. He had seen it happen to too many others, but experiencing it firsthand stirred a deep anger in him, not because he was special, but because this was proof. Proof that even a man with a law degree, a sharp suit, and a well-known name could be reduced to just another suspect based on his appearance. A murmur of voices carried from the hallway outside his cell. "Who's the suit?" "Just another one who thinks he's above the law." Daniel clenched his jaw. They hadn't even bothered to look at his ID properly. To them, he was just a black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. A heavy-set officer walked in, glancing at a clipboard before looking down at Daniel. He crossed his arms. "What's your story?" Daniel exhaled slowly, keeping his tone level. "My story is that I was unlawfully detained outside this very station. I'm an attorney, and I was scheduled to meet with the chief regarding an internal investigation." The officer snorted. "Sure you were." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I'd suggest you check with the chief before the situation gets any worse." The officer chuckled and shook his head. "Nice try. You're not the first one to talk big in here. Daniel remained silent. There was no use arguing with someone who had already decided what he believed. Instead, he let the weight of his presence fill the room. His calm demeanor, his unwavering gaze, it unsettled the officer. Daniel could see it in the way his smirk faltered just a little before he turned and left. Minutes passed, then an hour. The door to the cell remained closed. Then, suddenly, chaos erupted outside. A voice, sharp and angry, sliced through the hallway. "What the hell have you done?" Daniel recognized that voice. The chief. The cell door swung open violently, and a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a deep frown stormed inside, his face red with barely restrained fury. Behind him, the same officers who had arrested Daniel stood frozen in shock. The chief held up a folder, his hand trembling slightly. "Do you know who this is?" His voice was dangerously low. "Silence. This is Daniel Hayes, the special investigator appointed by the DA's office to oversee the corruption case against our department." The two arresting officers paled. The chief turned to them, his rage barely contained. "You arrested a man who was supposed to determine whether our officers are engaging in discriminatory practices, and you didn't even bother checking his credentials?" The taller officer swallowed hard. "Sir, we enough?" The chief rubbed his temples, then turned to Daniel. "Mr. Hayes, I am deeply sorry for this mistake." Daniel slowly stood, brushing the wrinkles out of his suit. "A mistake," he echoed. The chief's eyes darted to the officers behind him. "This is an embarrassment. I will personally ensure that disciplinary action is taken." Daniel exhaled through his nose. He could see the fear in the chief's eyes, not just because of what had happened, but because of what it represented. "This isn't just about me, Chief," Daniel said calmly. "This is about a culture in your department that allows things like this to happen. If I were an attorney, if I didn't have this position of influence, do you think I would have been treated any differently?" The chief swallowed. "I understand." Daniel studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then let's do something about it." The officers behind the chief looked like they had swallowed nails. They knew they had just handed Daniel the most damning piece of evidence against them, themselves. Daniel Hayes walked out of the holding cell with the chief at his side, his expression unreadable. He had been detained in this very building for hours, treated like a criminal by the same officers who now stood rigid as he passed. He could see the shame in their faces, the nervous glances, the way some avoided eye contact entirely. "Good,"